Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen. So, like I said in the teacher message video, what we're going to be talking about today is the Kansas-Nebraska crisis. And we're going to be focusing on two parts of that crisis. We're going to focus on the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and we're going to be focusing on Bleeding Kansas, which we're going to be talking about. That's going to really kind of be the two parts of the Kansas-Nebraska crisis. So what I want to do real quick is I'm just going to go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. And just because I'm recording this at the same time as I'm trying to load this, it's going to take a second. There we go. So just to review a little bit from class on Wednesday. There we go. Just want to move that down a little bit. Just so we review from class on Wednesday, we left off, we were talking about the Compromise of 1850. So we remember after the Mexican-American War in 1848, the United States has all of this new land. So it's got everything from Texas all the way up going this way into the Utah Territory, the New Mexico Territory, and California. So all of this new land has become part of the United States as of 1848. 2 years later, California is applying to become a state in the Union, part of the United States. It's applying to become a free state. So because California is asking to be a free state in the United States, a compromise has to be reached because that would throw the slave state, free state balance out of whack, and it would put that balance in favor of free states. So as a result of that, we come up with a compromise of 1850, where you have a lot of benefits for the North. You have California coming in as a free state. Texas is no longer going to try to advance itself west. It's going to leave the New Mexico Territory and the Utah Territory to kind of form themselves. And Washington, D.C. is no longer going to sell slaves. You cannot sell slaves in Washington, D.C. You can own them. But the two reasons, if we remember, that the South decided to agree with the Compromise of 1850 was because popular sovereignty would decide whether the Utah Territory or the New Mexico Territory would be free or slave, as well as the fact that there would be a new fugitive slave law that would be put in place where slave catchers could now go into the northern states and bring slaves back to the South. They used to not be able to do that, but now with this new fugitive slave law, this is something that Southern plantation owners can send slave catchers to do. So that is the compromise that is arrived at. That's the compromise that that Congress and the president come up with. So that's the compromise that is reached. And for 3 years, that is a compromise that stands. Until we get to 1853, where the United States begins to build a railroad that stretches from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And they want to connect California to the rest of the United States so supplies can get there and you can travel very quickly and very easily from New York, as well as other states on the Atlantic Ocean and in the Atlantic Ocean, all the way to California. Normally, you would have to take a boat all the way around. You could either take it through Panama or you could take it all the way around South America and come back up, and that's a months-long journey. If you can have a transcontinental railroad that stretches from the East Coast to the West, you're talking days, not months. So that's something that the United States begins to look at. Now, both the North and the South want this transcontinental railroad to run through their section of the country because they know it will make them improve their economies. It's a railroad always means that brings people out. You can transport goods. You can start to build towns along those railroads. Businesses can sprout up along the railroads to ship goods either to the east or to the west, whatever direction you need to go. So with this railroad is going to come more businesses and a stronger economy and more economic opportunities for that section of the country. So the South would like it, and so would the North. Now, the guy who creates it, a senator from Illinois by the name of Stephen Douglas, he doesn't want this transcontinental railroad to go through the South, because he knows if he does that, slavery is going to expand to the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory, and he doesn't want that to happen. So he's going to try to build it in the north. But if he tries to build it in the north, Southern congressmen are going to try to block it. So he comes up with a compromise for the building of this transcontinental railroad and keeping it in the north. And what he comes up with is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, the main part of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and we'll see it on the next slide, but I want to show you this map real quick. The main kind of focus of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is that in order to build this railroad, the government is going to have to take this unorganized territory and they're going to have to split it into one or more territories. And in the case of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they split it into two. You have the Nebraska Territory, which is much larger and farther north, and you have the Kansas Territory, which is right around this portion here and close to the 3630 line that the Missouri Compromise had set up that said everything north of this is going to be free, everything south is going to be slave. So the Kansas Territory is very close to the slave states in the south. And the way that the way that Douglas gets Southerners to support this transcontinental railroad traveling through these unorganized territories is to agree that the Kansas and Nebraska territories, whether they will be free or slave, will be decided by popular sovereignty. As in, the people of Kansas, the people that move to Kansas, and the people that move to Nebraska will get a vote as to whether they want their territory to be free or slave. That is that is the compromise that Douglas makes in order to get the South on board with this transcontinental railroad plan. He is going to take and create the Kansas and Nebraska territories and the unorganized territories, and he's going to allow them to decide whether they want to be free or slave by popular sovereignty, by a vote from the people in those territories. So let me just go ahead and advance the slide. So like I said, oh man, I can't talk today. I'm sorry, guys. The act forms the Kansas and Nebraska territories. And those two territories are going to be, whether they're going to be free or slave, is going to be decided by popular sovereignty. Now, this happens in 1854, and very quickly, Douglas is going to realize how big of a mistake he has actually made, because as soon as the act is passed, thousands of pro-slavery and thousands of anti-slavery Americans traveled to Kansas to try to make it a free or a slave state. And eventually violence is going to break out. At one point, the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, Kansas is going to be burned to the ground by pro-slavery supporters, by people that support the idea of Kansas becoming a slave state. Well, this doesn't sit well, and actually let me move up. Let me move myself up real quick here. Perfect. So this does not sit well with a guy by the name of John Brown. Now, John Brown is an anti-slavery northerner, and we are going to see him. He is also going to play another major role in the causes of the Civil War, but he plays a small role here. And he is going to lead a handful of men, a group of men, and he is going to take and capture 5 pro-slavery settlers, and he is going to butcher them, murder them brutally in Franklin County, Kansas, north of what is known as Pottawatomie Creek. And this is going to be known as the Pottawatomie Massacre. So we can already see the violence and the disagreement that is going to happen. Eventually, after that event, pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces on either side are going to basically carry out a mini civil war in the state of Kansas. It's going to kind of be a preview of what the Civil War is going to look like. And that mini Civil War is going to earn Kansas the nickname of Bleeding Kansas. So we can see that the Kansas-Nebraska Act has really created this violent crisis that springs up in the territory of Kansas. And in reality, it actually expands and spreads to the rest of the United States and actually makes its way. The violence doesn't, but the feeling and the resentment between, and the disagreement between pro-slavery forces and anti-slavery forces is really going to build and become much, much stronger as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas. So, and it's going to get so bad that violence is actually going to break out on the Senate floor. Now, after Bleeding Kansas, a Massachusetts senator by the name of Charles Sumner is going to give a speech basically criticizing anyone that supports slavery, basically kind of condemning them and insulting them a little bit. Well, one of the relatives that Charles Sumner calls out by name, a congressman by the name, he calls out one person, and the relative of that person, Preston Brooks, the congressman, decides that he's not going to take this. So as Charles Sumner is giving another speech on the Senate floor, Brooks marches down to where Sumner is giving a speech and beats him within an inch of his life with the cane that he is holding. That event is known as the caning of Charles Sumner. And it's where Preston Brooks is so offended and so angry by what Charles Sumner says that he beats him on the Senate floor unconscious with his cane and almost kills him. So this is kind of an example we've seen, as we saw in 2016, we've seen the past 3 years, how people are criticizing President Trump. And I'm sure you guys have heard your parents say that Donald Trump is the worst president ever, and I have never seen so much hatred and so much disagreement and people being so at odds with each other and stuff like that. Now, I'm not saying whether I support or am against Donald Trump, that doesn't matter. But I'm sure you guys have heard parents or relatives or somebody saying that the times that we are living in have never been more divided. People have never been more divided. People have never disagreed more strongly. People have never said the things to each other that they are saying now. And I would just like to point out, just as a counterpoint to that in 1854, a man was almost beaten to death on the Senate floor. So we have not seen that happen since 1854. So as bad as it is, this is pretty bad too. So this is pretty violent. This is also a time where you saw some very strong disagreement and some very strong resentment. And you absolutely saw one congressman beat the heck out of a senator on the Senate floor in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. So just to add a little bit of perspective, that's not to say that Donald Trump is a great president or Donald Trump is a bad president. That's just to point out that times where we have disagreed with each other as a country and as citizens have existed before, and it's actually been slightly more violent before. But this just kind of goes to show how we're getting to the point where the only way to solve the slavery issue is going to be through a civil war. If people are kind of standing by their points and standing by their beliefs so strongly that you have a congressman that is willing to beat a senator half to death, on the Senate floor, then obviously it's getting to the point of no return. So we can see how passionately people feel about the issue of slavery and how it's going to be very difficult to compromise on that issue. So after 7 years of debating and fighting, Kansas is finally admitted to the Union as a free state. Bleeding Kansas clearly proved the flaws in popular sovereignty, and the issue had become so polarizing that it was impossible to have fair elections to decide whether slavery would exist in the state or not. So we can see that people are really kind of, as I said in the previous slide, that the people that support slavery and people that don't support slavery are at opposite ends. There is no compromise. We're getting to a point where there is no compromise that will satisfy one side or the other. So at some point, and to kind of make it clear, in in 4 years, or I'm sorry, in 6 years, you are going to see the United States kind of split and break away, and you are going to have all out war and have that civil war happen. Excuse me. Sorry, guys. But Bleeding Kansas gives a preview of what's to come and helps us to understand that we have gotten to the point where people are no longer willing to compromise and they're no longer willing to settle and give a little and take a little to be able to keep the country together. So that sums up the idea of Bleeding Kansas, and that sums up why Bleeding Kansas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act are going to help lead to the Civil War, realizing it's kind of illustrating and showing that the slavery issue is it's going to be very difficult to get people to compromise on the slavery issue and on whether states should be admitted as slave or free states or what have you. So that sums up the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Kansas-Nebraska Crisis. That's what I wanted to talk about and make sure that I mentioned. That is the second reason and the second step towards the Civil War. The third and fourth step we are going to take a look at next week on Wednesday and Friday. So that is the plan. We should be wrapping up the road to the Civil War next week, and we should be all set with the road to the Civil War next week, and we should be able to take and finish the Civil War in a couple weeks. So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up what I wanted to talk about today. I hope you have a fantastic day today, and I will catch you guys, and I hope you have a great weekend, and I will catch you guys next week when we continue talking about the lead up to the Civil War. All right, so let me just go ahead and exit out of this real quick, guys, and it's being slow. So with that said, have a great day, guys. I'll catch you guys.